We'd like to welcome you to our symposium this morning, Restoring and Managing the Emerald Islands of the Sagebrush Sea, New Science, Sticks and Stones, and the Eager Beaver. We'd like to recognize a few of our sponsors this morning that made this possible: the NRCS Sage-Grouse Initiative and the NRCS Working Lands for Wildlife Program, the Bureau of Land Management, the Intermountain West Joint Venture, specifically their help for organizing the logistics of the session, as well as live streaming this online, and Utah State University for their help with the live stream as well. So this session is being broadcast online to hundreds of individuals across the country. They're tuning in and watching. Because of that, we have a few housekeeping rules. One, we need to keep on time, like we do in all sessions. Two, I need the speakers to glue themselves to this podium and keep standing right here, because if you move away from this mic, people online will not be able to hear you. The last thing is, when you are asked a question, please repeat the question into the microphone so that people online can hear that question. Okay, let's get going. Our first speaker will be Jeremy Maestas from the NRCS West Tech Center, and he will be speaking to us, introducing the session, speaking to us about these mesic restorations.
Hey, thanks, Brady, and appreciate everybody who's here live and online this morning. We're broadcasting the session. I cut into my time a little bit, so I'll have to go a little bit quicker, but I want to set up kind of the day and start with a little bit of background. The Sage-Grouse Initiative partners across the West have really started to accelerate protection, restoration, and enhancement of wet habitats in sagebrush country. And if you've been tracking what we've been doing, really we're using sage-grouse as a focal species to help us tackle big ecosystem problems. And so that theme will be woven throughout how we're now addressing some of these rare wet habitats. But beyond that, this really isn't about sage-grouse. At a fundamental level, what we're trying to do is take advantage of what little moisture we get in this arid rangeland and store it in those soil moisture reservoirs on the landscape to grow the green groceries that wildlife and livestock and people need. So keep that in mind, and I'll give you a quick overview of some of the types of things we're equipping people with ideas and tools to help them maybe do something about this problem. So just from a lens of sage-grouse, right, in terms of the landscape, they're one of these species that uses vast, multiple watersheds to complete their life cycle. Here's a typical life cycle diagram of sage-grouse. Most of the work we've been doing is in that sagebrush uplands associated with breeding and nesting habitats, right, and for good reason. That's where a lot of our, that's what the bulk of the landscape is. That's driving a lot of the vital rates. But there is a period of time in the summer that as that hot heat dries those soils, water and green groceries become very limiting. And so sage-grouse with their chicks need a diet rich in forbs and insects. And so they're following the green line as that landscape dries up in search of these late brood habitats. And so just to define the types of resources we're talking about, when I say wet, or you may hear the term mesic habitat, really what we're talking about are like the riparian and wet meadow corridors, the high elevation uplands that are productive throughout the summer, springs and seeps, and even some of our human modified meadows, irrigated meadows in the bottoms. What kind of was an aha moment for our team was some work we did with Patrick Donnelly, who will be our next speaker. Some background information here. He took and looked at Landsat satellite imagery in a region across Oregon and Nevada and California, looked at patterns of wetness in these rare mesic resources, compared that to sage-grouse abundance through lek counts. And when we plotted all out that through time, through space, we noticed some really interesting patterns. And one of them is that there was this theme of higher bird abundance near these reliably wet habitats. And so we've always known that sage-grouse are selecting landscapes that are large, intact sagebrush uplands. But those hens are also thinking about what happens when those chicks hatch and they have to feed them a lot of forbs. And so they're picking areas where they have access to a reliable wet habitat. Of course, we're talking about water in a rangeland ecosystem, and this is way bigger than grouse. There are a lot of species of concern that spend a portion of their life cycle on these habitats, not to mention the humans that settled the West and have, largely own a lot of these water resources. But we have plenty of challenges, and you can see the signatures of these challenges all across the landscape, from channel incision to head cuts in meadows, gullies in the uplands, and even some of the widespread conifer encroachment that's affecting hydrology. These things all determine, the timing and amount of water moving through our watersheds. I want you to remember one thing. This fundamentally is about restoring the sponge. Getting our landscapes from these drainage ditches back to piggy banks that store that moisture for use later in the growing season, right? Most of our precip comes as winter precip. So we want to be able to capture that, slow it down, and put it to work in that soil moisture profile to have more productive vegetation and ultimately more resilience against drought. So the shared vision that we're outlining here is really about promoting resilience of these water resources on the landscape. Resilience to high precip events, drought, you name it. And I want to tell you just a quick story. This is a watershed in Wyoming I visited a couple of years ago. On the right-hand side here, that incised channel occurred after the ranch hand trapped out the beavers, and the following spring had a high flow event. Anyway, that system basically unraveled. And if you can see that white pipe sticking out of the ground down there, that was an irrigation diversion that they used to irrigate a very large meadow. That's now sitting 3 feet above the channel bed. And so that resilience has been reduced for both ecosystems and for humans. That's going to dry that meadow. Meanwhile, if you go right over that hill to the next drainage where they hadn't got around to taking the beaver out yet, same type of high flow event came down. Water through that complexity of the beaver dam complexes that were there actually had access to a floodplain. There was a lot of roughness. It deposited sediment. Water was stored in the banks, and you didn't have the incision. You preserved the capability to irrigate that large green meadow. So this is both about the ecosystem and people's ability to make a living on the land. So one of the first things we did with SGI to understand this issue was enlisted the help of some of our team to actually map where are these resources and what are they doing through time. And so there will be more on this later. I don't want to say too much. But we have an incredible capability today to take satellite imagery through largely Landsat, go back 32 years, run it through a cloud computing platform called Google Earth Engine, and now have a map like this that anybody could access and start to visualize where are these resources. And we're talking about those late summer ribbons that are productive. And so July to September, high NDVI, which is an index of productivity. And you can see how some of these are green, they're wet every year for the 32 years, and others are red. Maybe they only got productive 1 year when it was really wet. So we could start to think about what we might want to do about that. The next thing we did was we enlisted our team to give us some thoughts on how can we really impact this issue of soil moisture storage, water resiliency. What are the practices we would want to do that would have the most impact? So I'm going to walk through each of these briefly, but know that they largely fall into two buckets. Those that are higher cost, that we're just not going to be able to do a lot of, but they're high impact, and lower cost things that we can engage more people in implementing at broader scales. What will be something you should pay attention to is what's not on this list. Things like traditional practices, when we used to do, riparian restoration meant stabilizing banks and doing a lot of expensive revegetation. Those things may be still applicable, But we're going to talk about hydrologic restoration before we ever get into those other types of things. And so it's kind of flipping our model a little bit and focusing on that hydrology. Okay, a real quick overview of these practices. Conservation easements, huge tool in our toolbox to keep private lands working and in agriculture. We want to keep that water on the landscape and not irrigating golf courses in Vegas. And so we're going to have to be highly selective in where these go. And so we want to use all the information we can to target them in the places that have the highest benefit for, grouse and other ecosystem services. The Tonka toy work. We've always been good at this. We have a large industry of riparian restoration folks that are doing taking incised channels, restoring them like we did. Here's an example of a project from Utah we did largely for water quality purposes, but had tremendous wet meadow benefits. Those things work, and the reality is we just can't do a lot of it because it's so expensive per mile. And so a lot of our emphasis this morning, today, and then as we do communication and training with our staff is we don't always have to use Tonka toys. What are some of those lower input approaches that we can perhaps engage more people in implementing at large scales? And so you're going to hear today about some what we call like sticks and stones approaches, where we're harnessing the ability of that system to let the water do the work and restore these incised channels. Everything from the Beaver Dam analogs, Beaver assisted restoration, to some of the rock work that Bill Zedike has pioneered in the Southwest. Amazing story. We have several speakers to tell this here today, but I just want to say, grazing management has a huge role to play, and I'm not talking about livestock exclusion. I'm talking about time-controlled grazing management with specific objectives to grow riparian vegetation and that resilience. Huge success story here in Nevada. Springs and seeps, these rare resources all across the landscape, impacted by a variety of factors. We're talking about what do we need to do to protect those, manage them properly, enhance them, and restore them wherever we can. Conifer removal, old practice in the toolbox, but with a new purpose. Our folks at ARS in Boise taught us about how juniper actually affects snow distribution on the landscape. So a sagebrush-dominated landscape will have more snow drifts. Those snow drifts, because of the windswept nature of an open landscape, actually delays water delivery by 9 days down that drainage. Think about how critical that is as we go through the summer. And then, of course, Bruce Roundy and others have showed us that on a site scale, conifer removal can actually enhance that soil water storage and availability by 2 to 3 weeks. So thinking about this practice in a new light. And the last thing I want to mention is outcomes. And so, there are a lot of ways to measure outcomes. One really simple and blunt instrument that we have is this Landsat data set. And so you can actually go into that website I mentioned, and Brady will show you some of this. But here's a project in Oregon. We delineated, this was a channel reconstruction project. You can see a picture of it. We dropped the shapefile into the web app, hit run, and what we get is a graph that'll spit out from 1984 to present the NDVI productivity on that polygon, the average productivity. And so what you can see here is that up until the year of restoration, which was like 2003 or 4, productivity was below that, what we call a productive level at like 0.3. It was pretty low. It bounced around. After restoration, you can see how it climbed up and it's reached a new steady state. It's really productive. Hydrology is returned near the surface, and we're growing vegetation that can be picked up on satellites from space. That's impact, that's outcomes, that's what we're trying to focus on. So with that, I'm excited to have you here today. Thank you to a whole team of folks out there that have worked with us on this, and then visit our website for a bunch of more information on it. So thank you for your time.